On September 18, 1982, at approximately 9:23 p.m., a woman walked into the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington, D.C. carrying a leather satchel that would dismantle her family. Her name was Elizabeth Harrison. She was 41 years old, and inside that satchel were photographs of classified documents, coded letters written in Russian, and a list of names in her husband's handwriting. By the time she left that building 4 hours later, her husband would be under federal investigation for espionage, and her 3 children would become the subjects of one of the most elaborate cover stories in Cold War history. The Harrisons lived in Bethesda, Maryland, a 25-minute commute from downtown Washington. They lived in a 3-story Victorian in a neighborhood where families attended the same church and children rode bicycles until their mothers called them in for dinner. Thomas worked as a senior analyst at the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, a position he'd held since 1975. Elizabeth worked part-time as an archivist at the Library of Congress, a position she'd scaled back from full-time after their second child was born in 1972. On her non-work days, Monday and Wednesday, she volunteered at the children's school library and managed the household accounts while their 3 children, Emily, David, and Rachel, were in class. According to neighbors interviewed years later, they seemed like any other family navigating the routines of suburban life in the early Reagan era. A dual-income household making it work through careful coordination of schedules and responsibilities. But on August 4, 1982, that perception began to crack. Elizabeth came home from a doctor's appointment early that day, around 1:45 in the afternoon, having been told her test results were normal and she could leave sooner than expected. Thomas had taken a personal day, claiming he needed to prepare for an important briefing. When Elizabeth pulled into the driveway, she noticed Thomas's car was there, but the house seemed unusually quiet. She entered through the back door, moving quietly because she thought Thomas might be napping in his study. What she found instead was her husband sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread before him, papers he swept into a folder the moment he heard her footsteps. His face, she would later testify, went pale in a way she had never seen before. He stammered something about working on a surprise for her birthday, which was 3 months away, and she might have believed him except for one detail. The papers had been covered in handwriting that wasn't English. She didn't confront him. Something in her, some instinct she couldn't name, told her to smile and accept his explanation and pretend she hadn't seen anything unusual. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of their bed, her heart pounding, telling herself she was being paranoid. Thomas loved her. Thomas loved their children. Thomas was a dedicated public servant who had devoted his career to American foreign policy. There was no reason to suspect him of anything, but the seed of doubt had been planted. And over the following weeks, Elizabeth found herself paying attention to details she had previously ignored. The first thing she noticed was Thomas's schedule. For years, he had worked late on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, claiming that those were the nights when his department held strategy meetings and briefings that couldn't be rescheduled. Elizabeth had never questioned this because it had always been true as far as she knew. But now she began tracking his arrivals and departures more carefully. On August 10th, a Tuesday, Thomas left for work at 7:15 a.m. as usual. Elizabeth called his office at 6:30 p.m. to ask what time he expected to be home for dinner. His secretary, a woman named Patricia who had worked with Thomas for 8 years, told Elizabeth that Thomas had left the office at 4:45 p.m., saying he wasn't feeling well and was going home early. Thomas didn't arrive home until 9:47 p.m. When Elizabeth asked where he had been, he said the meeting had run late. When she mentioned that she had called his office, his expression flickered for just a moment before he recovered and said Patricia must have been confused, that he had been in a classified briefing she wouldn't have known about. Elizabeth noted the discrepancy in a small notebook she had begun keeping in her nightstand drawer. On August 17th, she found something more concrete. Thomas had been doing laundry, an unusual occurrence since Elizabeth typically handled household chores, and he had left his suit jacket on the bedroom chair. When Elizabeth went to hang it in the closet, she felt something in the inside pocket. It was a receipt from a restaurant in Georgetown, dated August 14th, for a lunch that had cost $47.83. The receipt showed 2 entrees, 2 glasses of wine, and 2 desserts. August 14th had been a Saturday. Thomas had told Elizabeth he was playing golf with his colleague Martin. He had left at 10 a.m. and returned at 4 p.m., and when Elizabeth asked how the game had gone, he had complained about his putting. She kept the receipt. The pattern continued through August and into September. Elizabeth became a detective in her own home, cataloging inconsistencies and anomalies that she had previously overlooked or explained away. Thomas frequently received phone calls in the evening that he took in his study with the door closed. He had developed a habit of checking the mailbox before Elizabeth could get to it, sorting through the contents quickly and occasionally pocketing something she couldn't see. He made frequent trips to the hardware store that lasted 2 or 3 hours but rarely resulted in any visible home improvements. On August 28th, Elizabeth followed him. She waited until Thomas left the house at 2 p.m., claiming he needed to pick up supplies for a shelf he was building in the garage. She gave him a 5-minute head start, then got in her car and followed at a distance, staying far enough back that he wouldn't recognize her vehicle. He didn't drive to the hardware store. Instead, he drove to Rock Creek Park, parked near the nature center, and walked along one of the trails until he reached a specific bench near a small footbridge. During that time, a man Elizabeth had never seen before approached from the opposite direction, sat on the same bench, and appeared to engage Thomas in casual conversation. After approximately 10 minutes, the man stood, folded a newspaper he had been carrying, and left it on the bench. Thomas picked up the newspaper, tucked it under his arm, and walked back to his car. Elizabeth photographed the entire exchange using a small camera she had purchased at a pawn shop 3 days earlier, paying cash and giving a false name. When Thomas came home that evening, he showed Elizabeth a bag from the hardware store containing sandpaper and wood stain. She smiled and asked him how the shelf was coming along. She noted in her journal that the bag appeared brand new, as if he had stopped at the hardware store specifically to create an alibi for his afternoon. The discovery that confirmed her worst suspicions came on September 3, 1982. Thomas had left for a weekend conference in Philadelphia, a State Department retreat he attended annually. Elizabeth had driven him to the airport, kissed him goodbye, and told him she would miss him. Then she had driven home, put the children to bed, and conducted a systematic search of her husband's study. She started with his desk, going through each drawer methodically, looking for anything that seemed out of place. She found nothing unusual: work documents, old letters, tax records, the ordinary detritus of a professional life. She checked the bookshelves, pulling out volumes and looking behind them. She examined the closet, the filing cabinet, the space behind the radiator. It was nearly midnight when she noticed the floor. Thomas's study had hardwood floors covered by an oriental rug that had belonged to his grandmother. Elizabeth had vacuumed that rug hundreds of times without ever moving it. But now, examining the room with fresh eyes, she noticed that one corner of the rug seemed slightly raised, as if something underneath was preventing it from lying flat. She pulled back the rug and found a loose floorboard. Beneath the floorboard was a metal lockbox approximately 10 inches by 8 inches. The lock was a simple combination mechanism. Elizabeth tried Thomas's birthday, their anniversary, the children's birthdays. On her 5th attempt, using the date of Thomas's father's death, the lock clicked open. Inside the box, Elizabeth found evidence that her husband of 17 years was working for the Soviet Union. The contents were devastating in their specificity. There were 27 photographs of classified documents, taken with a small camera in low light. Some were documents Elizabeth recognized from Thomas's descriptions of his work at the State Department: intelligence assessments, diplomatic cables, analysis of Soviet military capabilities. Others were materials he should never have had access to: CIA briefings, NSA intercepts, documents stamped with classification levels that made Elizabeth's hands shake. There were 6 letters written in Russian, which Elizabeth could not read but could recognize. There was a small notebook filled with columns of numbers and abbreviations. There were $500 in cash, all in 20s. And there was a passport with Thomas's photograph but a different name: David Kowalski, with a listed address in Chicago. Elizabeth sat on the floor of her husband's study until 3 a.m., the contents of the box spread around her, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with the man she had married in 1965. The man who had proposed to her on a beach in Maine, who had cried when their first child was born, who read bedtime stories in funny voices and coached David's Little League team and brought her flowers every anniversary without fail. She thought about their wedding, about the birth of their children, about 18 years of ordinary moments that now seemed like an elaborate performance. She wondered when it had started. She wondered if their entire marriage had been a cover, if she had been selected and cultivated the way an intelligence officer might develop an asset. She wondered if Thomas had ever loved her, or if she had been nothing more than a useful prop in his double life, a woman with no connections to government work who would never think to question her loyal husband. She photographed everything in the box, replaced the items exactly as she had found them, put the rug back in place and went to bed. She did not sleep. She lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of her children breathing in their rooms down the hall, and she made a decision. She would turn Thomas in. But first, she would protect her children from the truth. Over the following 2 weeks, Elizabeth conducted her own investigation while Thomas continued his ordinary routine, unaware that his wife had discovered his secret. She documented his movements, his phone calls, his schedule. She noted that he always left the house on Tuesday evenings between 7 o'clock and 7:30 p.m., always returning between 9:30 and 10 p.m. She noted that he received a phone call every Sunday afternoon at exactly 3:15 p.m., always taking it in his study with the door closed. On September 12th, she followed him again. This time he drove to a shopping mall in Arlington, parked on the second level of the parking garage, and walked to the food court. He sat at a table near the fountain and was joined after approximately 5 minutes by a woman Elizabeth had never seen before. Late 40s, dark hair, well-dressed, carrying a large shopping bag from a department store. They spoke for nearly 30 minutes. At one point, Thomas handed the woman an envelope. At another point, the woman reached into her shopping bag and passed something under the table to Thomas, something small that he slipped into his jacket pocket. When they parted, they did not embrace or shake hands. They simply stood, nodded to each other, and walked in opposite directions. Elizabeth photographed the meeting from a store across the food court, pretending to browse merchandise while her camera captured image after image. On September 15th, she checked the lockbox again. The envelope Thomas had given to the woman at the mall was gone. In its place were 3 new photographs of documents and a fresh letter in Russian. Elizabeth had seen enough. On September 18th, 1982, she walked into the Edgar Hoover building and asked to speak with someone about a matter of national security. Special Agent William Crawford, the lead investigator who took Elizabeth's initial statement, later described the meeting in a declassified debriefing memo. Elizabeth arrived at 9:23 p.m., waited 19 minutes before approaching the front desk, and then spent the next 4 hours laying out everything she had discovered. Crawford's notes indicate that Elizabeth was calm, methodical, and emotionally controlled, though she paused several times when describing what she had found. The FBI had been aware of a leak from the State Department since mid-1981. Intelligence assessments and diplomatic communications had been appearing in Soviet hands with alarming regularity, and the Bureau had narrowed the source to the Bureau of Intelligence and Research without identifying the specific individual. Elizabeth's evidence gave them everything they needed: a name, a method, a timeline, and photographic documentation of meetings with what appeared to be a Soviet handler. But Elizabeth had come with a request that created what Crawford later called an unprecedented operational consideration. She wanted to tell her children that their father had died. Not that he had been arrested. Not that he was a traitor. She wanted to construct a story about a car accident, a sudden tragedy, a funeral they would attend and mourn and eventually move past. She wanted Thomas arrested quietly, processed under a sealed indictment, and removed from their lives in a way that would leave their memory of him intact. Crawford's report notes that he found the request deeply troubling but also understandable. Elizabeth had spent 2 weeks thinking about how to protect Emily, David, and Rachel from the devastating knowledge that their father was a Soviet spy. She had concluded that the truth would damage them more than any lie she could construct. The request went up the chain of command. There were meetings, consultations with Justice Department attorneys, discussions about the ethical and legal implications of cooperating with such a deception. Ultimately, the decision was made to accommodate Elizabeth's request, partly because a quiet arrest served the Bureau's counterintelligence interests in not alerting other potential Soviet assets, and partly because there was genuine sympathy for the children who would otherwise become known as the kids whose father betrayed his country. Thomas Harrison was arrested at 5:30 a.m. on September 20th, 1982, a Monday morning, as he was leaving for work. Federal agents approached his car in the driveway, showed him the warrant, and took him into custody before any of the neighbors had emerged for their morning routines. According to the arrest report, Thomas did not resist. He looked at the house where his family was still sleeping and asked if he could say goodbye to his children. The agents told him that would not be possible. Elizabeth gathered Emily, David, and Rachel in the living room that evening and told them their father had been killed in a car accident on his way to work that morning. A drunk driver, she said. Instant death, she said. He didn't suffer, she said. She had prepared for their questions. She had researched traffic fatalities, learned enough about impact injuries to make the lie sound plausible. She had obtained a death certificate through means she never disclosed, had arranged for a closed casket funeral at a church the family had attended occasionally, had written an obituary that would appear in the local paper. The children believed her because why wouldn't they? Their mother was not a woman given to lies or manipulation. If she said their father was dead, then their father was dead. The funeral was held on September 25, 1982. Friends and colleagues attended, offering condolences and casseroles and promises to help with anything the family needed. Thomas's parents flew in from Ohio, weeping for the son they would never see again. Elizabeth accepted embraces and sympathy and flowers, and she never once broke character. Thomas Harrison's guilty plea proceedings began on February 14, 1983, handled under the Classified Information Procedures Act with all records sealed and no public access. He pleaded guilty to 4 counts: conspiracy to commit espionage, unauthorized possession and transmission of national defense information, acting as an agent of a foreign government, and providing material support to foreign intelligence operations. The prosecution's case established that Thomas had been recruited in 1972 by a Soviet intelligence officer named Viktor Sorokin, who had approached him at an academic conference in Vienna and gradually developed him as an asset over the following 2 years. By 1974, Thomas was providing classified documents on a regular basis, photographing materials from his office and passing them to handlers through a network of dead drops and personal meetings. He had been motivated initially by ideology, the prosecution argued. Thomas had been privately critical of American foreign policy, particularly regarding Vietnam and détente. But over time, the motivation had shifted to money. Documents introduced at the sealed proceedings showed that Thomas had received approximately $180,000 over the course of his espionage career, funds deposited in offshore accounts under the name on his false passport. When asked about his wife and children, Thomas's response, preserved in court transcripts, was brief. He said he had kept his activities completely separate from his family life. He said Elizabeth had never suspected anything. He said he had genuinely loved his wife and children, that his family life had not been a performance, that the two halves of his existence had coexisted in his mind without apparent contradiction. The judge sentenced him to 30 years in federal prison. He was transferred to a maximum security facility within a week. Back in Bethesda, Elizabeth Harrison was executing the second phase of her plan, maintaining the fiction that Thomas was dead. She kept his photographs throughout the house. She took the children to visit his grave, a plot she had purchased in a local cemetery with a headstone bearing his name and dates. She spoke about him in past tense, sharing memories of their life together, preserving an image of Thomas as a loving husband and devoted father who had been taken from them too soon. The children adjusted as children do. Emily, the oldest at 13, became protective of her younger siblings, taking on responsibilities beyond her years. David, 11, became quiet and withdrawn, spending hours in his room building model airplanes. Rachel, 8, asked when Daddy was coming back for months after the funeral, unable to fully comprehend the permanence of death. Elizabeth wrote to Thomas occasionally, letters she sent through FBI intermediaries, letters that were brief and businesslike and devoid of personal emotion. She told him about the children's progress. She never told him that she had told them he was dead. Thomas wrote back, letters that arrived in plain envelopes with no return address. He asked about the children constantly. He asked if he could see them. He asked Elizabeth to explain to them what had happened, to let them know he was alive, to give him a chance to maintain some relationship with them. Elizabeth never responded to these requests. She told herself she was protecting them. She told herself the lie was necessary. She told herself that knowing their father was a traitor would be more damaging than believing their father was dead. The lie might have continued indefinitely if not for a coincidence that occurred in 1990. Emily Harrison, by then a 21-year-old senior at Georgetown University, was taking a seminar on Cold War intelligence history. The professor, a former CIA analyst named Dr. Robert Kaplan, mentioned in passing that one of the most damaging Soviet penetrations of the State Department had occurred in the early 1980s, perpetrated by an analyst whose identity remained classified but who had been sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Emily approached Dr. Kaplan after class with questions. She was interested in the case for academic reasons, she said. She was writing a paper on Cold War espionage. Dr. Kaplan, pleased by her interest, provided her with several declassified documents and suggested she file a FOIA request for additional materials. The documents Emily received 3 months later did not identify the spy by name, but they did identify his position, senior analyst in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. They identified the time frame of his activities, 1974 to 1982. They identified his method of passing information, dead drops in Rock Creek Park and personal meetings at various locations in the Washington area. Emily knew her father had worked in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. She knew he had died in 1982. She knew he had frequently gone to Rock Creek Park for what he called nature walks. She did not confront her mother immediately. Instead, she spent 3 months conducting her own investigation, pulling every record she could access, calling in favors from professors with government connections, slowly assembling a picture that made her physically ill to contemplate. On June 14, 1991, she sat down with Elizabeth in the kitchen of their family home and asked her mother directly, "Was Daddy a Soviet spy? Is he still alive?" Elizabeth's account of what followed, given years later in a family therapy session, was that she considered lying. For approximately 30 seconds, she considered maintaining the fiction, telling Emily she was being paranoid, dismissing her research as coincidence. But looking at her daughter's face, seeing the determination and the fear and the desperate hope that she was wrong, Elizabeth could not sustain the lie any longer. She told Emily the truth, all of it. The discovery, the investigation, the arrest, the decision to tell the children their father was dead. She explained her reasoning, her desire to protect them, her belief that the truth would have been more damaging. Emily's response, according to Elizabeth's account, was to leave the room without speaking. She walked out of the house, got in her car, and drove away. She did not return for 3 days. When Emily did return, she brought David and Rachel with her. She had told them everything, and the 3 Harrison children confronted their mother with questions that Elizabeth could not adequately answer. Why had she lied? Why had she assumed they couldn't handle the truth? Why had she denied them the opportunity to know their father as he actually was, to visit him, to ask him their own questions, to make their own decisions about how to process his betrayal? Why had she taken that agency away from them for 9 years? Why had she let them mourn a man who wasn't dead? David, who had spent his adolescence grieving his father's loss, who had dropped out of college after a breakdown attributed to unresolved grief, who had spent years in therapy working through the trauma of losing a parent at 11 years old, expressed his reaction in terms that the family therapist would later describe as volcanic. He had been lied to for 9 years. He had cried at a fake grave. He had prayed for a man who was alive and could have been contacted at any time. Rachel, the youngest, responded with a quiet devastation that proved more lasting than her siblings' anger. She had been 8 when her father supposedly died. She had only fragmentary memories of him. She had spent her entire conscious life believing a lie, constructing an identity around the absence of a father who wasn't actually absent. The 3 Harrison children visited their father in federal prison for the first time in August 1991. Thomas was 54 years old, 9 years into his sentence. According to the prison visitation log, the meeting lasted 3 hours. What happened during those 3 hours comes primarily from the children's later accounts. Thomas cried when he saw them. He asked about their lives, their educations, their relationships. He apologized repeatedly, not for his espionage, which he seemed to view as a separate compartment of his life, but for being absent from their childhoods. He asked why they hadn't come sooner, why Elizabeth had kept them away. When they told him that Elizabeth had told them he was dead, that they had mourned him, that they had visited his grave, Thomas's reaction was described by Emily as the most profound grief she had ever witnessed in another human being. He sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes, tears running down his face, before he said anything. He said he had written hundreds of letters over the years. He said he had begged Elizabeth to let the children know he was alive. He said he had never received any indication that they believed he was dead. The Harrison children began visiting regularly after that first meeting. They built a relationship with their father, though it was a relationship conducted in prison visiting rooms, constrained by time limits and supervised by guards. They asked him about his espionage, about his motivations, about how he had justified his actions to himself. They asked him whether he had ever loved their mother, whether he had ever loved them, whether any of their childhood memories were real. Thomas's answers were complicated. He said he had loved Elizabeth genuinely, that his marriage had not been a cover. He said he had compartmentalized his life, that the part of him that was a husband and father had been authentic even while another part of him was betraying his country. He said he had told himself that what he was doing was not really espionage, that he was simply sharing information that would promote understanding between nations, that he was working toward peace in his own way. The children did not fully accept these explanations, but they continued visiting. Elizabeth Harrison's relationship with her children never fully recovered. Emily maintained contact but kept emotional distance, visiting on holidays and calling on birthdays while never again confiding in her mother the way she once had. David refused to speak to Elizabeth for over 4 years, communicating only through Emily when family logistics required it. Rachel maintained the most regular contact but described their relationship in a later interview as hollow, going through the motions of a mother-daughter relationship without the underlying trust that such a relationship requires. Family therapist Dr. Michael Chun, who worked with the Harrisons beginning in 1992, later described the case as illustrating a fundamental paradox of protective deception. Elizabeth had lied to protect her children from pain, but the discovery of the lie had caused pain that might exceed what the truth would have caused. The children had not simply lost their father twice, once when he was arrested and once when they learned he was alive. They had also lost their mother in a sense, lost their ability to trust that she was telling them the truth about anything. Thomas Harrison was released from federal prison on March 3, 2008, after serving 25 years of his sentence. He was 71 years old. His children met him at the prison gates, the first time they had seen him outside of a visitation room in a quarter century. He moved to a small apartment in Philadelphia, close to where David had eventually settled. He found part-time work at a used bookstore. He attended his grandchildren's birthday parties and school plays, a quiet presence on the edges of family gatherings, never quite belonging but no longer entirely excluded. Elizabeth Harrison still lives in the house in Bethesda where she raised her children. She is 81 years old now. She and Thomas have not spoken since 1991, when the children confronted her with the truth. She has never apologized for the lie she told, has never acknowledged that she might have made a different choice. In a rare interview given to a researcher in 2019, she said simply, "I did what I thought was best for my children. I was wrong about some things, but I was trying to protect them." The children, now in their 50s and 60s, have reached their own uneasy peace with what happened. Emily works as a professor of international relations, specializing in Cold War history. David runs an engineering firm in Philadelphia. Rachel became a family therapist, specializing in cases involving parental deception and betrayal. None of them have entirely forgiven either parent, but all of them have come to understand that the story of Thomas and Elizabeth Harrison is not a simple narrative about right and wrong. It is a story about the impossible choices people make when faced with situations that have no good options, about how love and fear can motivate the same actions, about how the consequences of those actions can ripple forward through generations in ways no one could have predicted. Thomas Harrison turned his country's secrets over to the Soviet Union because he believed, at some level, that he was serving a higher purpose. Elizabeth Harrison lied to her children for 9 years because she believed, at some level, that she was protecting them from unbearable pain. And both of those choices were simultaneously acts of conviction and acts of betrayal, depending on which angle you view them from.